Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Lebanese mountain bread. That's right, as promised, I'm going to show you my take on what has become my favorite flatbread. And possibly, at least for the time being, maybe my favorite bread. Oh, and by the way, if you happen to live on a mountain in Lebanon, and at some point during this video you think to yourself, hey, that's not how we do it. Well, I just wanted to quickly mention, this is how they do it on the other mountain. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this very simple and sort of pizza-like dough. And we'll begin by dumping a portion of our bread flour into a bowl, followed by a teaspoon of dry active yeast. Or is it active dry yeast? I forget, but same stuff. And then we'll also toss in a little touch of sugar, followed by some warm but not too hot water. Okay, I usually shoot for about 105 degrees, which should basically feel like warm bath water. Although that probably doesn't help much, since I don't think people take baths anymore. I mean, who's got that kind of time? Especially considering all the hours we spend on social media. But anyway, what we'll do at this point is give that a mix to complete what some people in the business would call a sponge. So what we'll do is mix that smooth, and then we'll go ahead and cover it and let it sit for about a half hour to an hour, or until it gets nice and bubbly, and hopefully it looks a little something like this. So that is looking good, and we clearly have a very enthusiastic yeast colony growing. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, which will include a spoon of olive oil, as well as a little bit of salt. And then last but not least, we'll dump in the rest of our flour. And even though I'm using bread flour here, I'm pretty sure this will work with all-purpose. And then what we'll do once all that's together is grab a wooden spoon, and we'll give this a mix. And we will keep mixing until it all pulls together to form a relatively sticky dough ball. Although, don't confuse sticky with wet. Okay, towards the end of this step, that dough ball should pull away from the bowl fairly cleanly, and the texture should be somewhat similar to this. So if yours does seem super wet, and is still sort of smearing against the bowl, you can add a little more flour. But this is looking pretty good. So at this point, I'll go ahead and transfer that to a well-floured surface to give it a little bit of a kneading. And as usual, we're using the bare minimum of flour, just enough to keep it from sticking to our fingers or the work surface. And what we'll do is work that dough for just about 2 minutes until we've formed, and stop me if you've heard this one before, a very soft, very supple, slightly elastic dough. And really all that means is if we press on it, it sort of springs back. So that is looking very nice, if I do say so myself. And once that's set, what we'll do is transfer that into a bowl that we've drizzled in a few drops of olive oil. And we'll kind of roll that dough around to coat it lightly. And that is pretty much it for our dough production. All we have left to do is cover this and leave it in some warm spot for about an hour to an hour and a half, or until it doubles in size. Okay, so the time is going to depend on how warm the spot is. But this is what mine looked like about an hour and 15 minutes later. And at this point, what we'll do is transfer that to our work surface and give it another quick knead to basically knock out all the air. And then once we have our dough successfully degassed, we have a couple options. We could use this right away if we had to, but I do not recommend it. What I suggest is transferring this into some kind of zip-top bag and place it in the fridge overnight before we use it. And I know I probably should have told you before we started that you're not going to be able to eat this till tomorrow, but trust me, you're going to get a better product. Right? Not only are the flavors going to develop, and it's going to be tastier, but the texture is going to be better, and the all-important stretching step is going to be easier. So I did in fact leave mine overnight, at which point it looks something like this. So it might grow a little bit in the fridge, but it's basically sort of going to look the same. But regardless, whether you use yours right away or leave it overnight like I did, the next steps are going to be the same. We're going to pinch off a portion of dough, for me something slightly smaller than a golf ball, and we'll go ahead and sort of rub and press that on the work surface to squeeze out all the air. At which point we'll begin a two-step formation process. And the first step will be to roll this out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, and again using just enough flour to keep it from sticking. Right, the one thing that most bad breads have in common, too much flour. So please be careful. But having said that, the dough is going to be sticky, so you are going to need some. And like I said, we're going to roll that out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, which sounds kind of thin, but not even close to how thin this needs to be. Which is why when it gets to this point, we're going to stop. And we'll give that a little stretch with our hands. And then, believe it or not, we will lay that over the top of the bottom of a lightly floured mixing bowl. And it's over this dome surface where we're going to stretch this incredibly thin, as in pretty much see-through. So it might take you a few seconds to get it started. But once you do, just keep going around, pulling it down, until basically you've stretched it as thin as humanly possible, without it tearing. And by the way, how this is done back in the old country is the dough is actually stretched over a round pillow, which is then used to flop it on top of the grill they use to cook this. But since you probably don't have a Lebanese mountain bread dough pillow, and mine's at the cleaners, we'll go ahead and use this upside-down bowl, which works quite nicely as you can see. And I should mention, if this looks a little too tricky, or like too much fun, and you just prefer to roll yours, it will still work. It just won't come out as thin or as good. But anyway, you decide. You are, after all, the Sherlock Holmes of stretching dough on domes. But anyway, what we'll do once our dough is stretched as thin as possible is very carefully with floured fingers transfer that into a very hot preheated dry cast iron skillet. Alright, so we're definitely going high heat here. And because of that, and because this dough's so thin, this is only going to take about 45 seconds to a minute per side. And as that first side cooks, you're going to see lots of little bubbles forming, which is exactly what we want to see. And after about a minute, we'll go ahead and flip that over. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm pushing down on it with a spatula, I'm not sure. You probably don't have to. Sometimes I just like to do things. But anyway, we'll give that side about a minute, and that's it. If your pan was hot enough, you should see some beautiful brown marks on those blisters. And then, very important, what we'll do as these finish is pile them up on top of each other. And then we'll keep those covered with either a towel or another plate. And what's going to happen because of the residual heat? Those are going to kind of gently steam, which is really the official final step of the cooking process. Right? These would still be pretty good if you didn't do that. But if you do, they're going to retain more moisture and be even more supple. So I think that's one of the keys. But anyway, that's it. My relatively simple method for simulating Lebanese mountain bread. And if you've never had this before, you're in for a huge treat. Alright, I guess it's sort of like pita bread, but thinner, tastier, stretchier, just better on every level. And as far as I'm concerned, just a vastly superior all-purpose flatbread. Which reminds me, don't feel like you have to make some exotic Middle Eastern food to eat with this. I mean, it's amazing with things as basic and simple as a BLT. Oh, and one quick bonus tip here. You definitely want to season your tomatoes with a little bit of salt and pepper, since that really does make a huge difference. But anyway, let me go ahead and roll this up. And right here I was trying to do the classic shawarma roll, where we kind of fold in the bottom so everything doesn't run out as we eat it. But I overstuffed it, so it didn't work. But I wasn't upset, mostly because I remembered I was just about to eat a BLT on Lebanese mountain bread, which really was fantastic. And I am not a big wrap guy. I never order a wrap, because they're usually served on some kind of insipid flour tortilla. Well, this, my friends, is roughly 1,000 times better than that dry, tasteless tortilla. But anyway, just an amazing flatbread, delicious and fun to make. The only slight downside to discovering this stuff is that now I'm significantly less impressed with our pita bread recipe. Sorry, pita bread, but we'll always have hummus. Anyway, kidding aside, I do find this stuff superior to that on almost every level, and I really do hope you give it a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.